My name's Anthony. I'm the pastor of Dot Church. We're going to do things a little bit differently tonight, like Albert said. I was originally going to try to write a talk about purity culture, but I actually felt a little bit out of my depth. I did not grow up in a purity culture context, so I didn't really feel that qualified to speak on it very well. But a pastor that I know out here in Chicagoland, he wrote this article that I think covers the big issues related to purity culture. So I'm actually going to walk through this article with our guest today, and I'm going to encourage you to be as active as possible in the chat when we dive into this topic. And we're going to try to interact with all of you as we go, as much as we can. And I'll actually put a link to the article in the chat if you want to follow along. It's on our website. If we don't get to your question, it could be for one of a few reasons. I'm going to try to keep us on topic. With something like purity culture, there's a ton of different rabbit trails that we could take. And if we don't get to your question, it's probably because it's too off topic, not because it's like too radical or something like that. There may be just simply too many questions that come in and we can't get to them all. But before we dive in, maybe you're thinking, why are we talking about purity culture, right? There's an author, her name is Linda K. Klein. She wrote a book about it in 2018. And she said that the purity culture movement, it started in the early 90s. So why would that be something that would be worth talking about today? Why did she feel the need to write a book in 2018? If you didn't grow up in a purity culture environment, this could maybe come as a bit of a surprise, but there are actually many people who are currently in counseling trying to undo many of the harmful things that came out of purity culture. And so we keep seeing also high-level Christians who are getting in trouble for big sexual scandals. And I think that it may be all tied together because many of these leaders either would have perpetuated these ideas in their churches or would have, used them themselves, which leads to the question, does purity culture even work? And is it even biblical? So for all of you on Twitter, I would recommend following Leah, who's joining us tonight. Follow her account. It's called Sassy Seminary Student. But I think, Leah, you did change the name. How do people find you? What is your handle right now?
My handle is Leah B. Sassy.
Leah B. Sassy. It's her Twitter account is just a constant stream of bangers. She posted one related to purity culture, and I was like, man, she would be a great person to speak into this. So everyone, if you could give Leah a big welcome in the chat. And then before we dive into this topic, Leah, I would just love if you would tell people a little bit about yourself. Who is this person behind this Twitter account? And like we were talking about before, how did it feel the moment when Beth Moore followed you on your account, which was just wild to me?
Hey everybody. So I am a first-year seminary student at Seminary in Waco, Texas. I'm from Alabama. I grew up in First Baptist Church, Huntsville, Alabama. And so it just kind of started to get into the theology world recently because I was a music major in college, music ed major, and I wanted to serve in the church as a musician. But I also think, I was like, I don't really know anything about ministry, about serving God, or even, I knew I had lots of gaps in my theology. So I really felt convicted to go to seminary and figure it out in a formal educational environment. And kind of at the same time, I started to delve a little bit into church politics because unfortunately, the two things do go hand in hand. So I decided to make a Twitter account where I could just kind of make satire, funny posts about my experience growing in both theology, but also in some church politics things. So it's been a fun journey, getting some pretty big, both good and bad, pretty big names responding to my account, which has been just so funny because there's some people on Twitter who don't understand that most of my tweets are just jokes, and they get very offended. But then there's lots of others who appreciate them. So it's been a fun journey. But I definitely did grow up in purity culture as a Southern Alabama Baptist. So I'm excited to talk about this tonight.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So for people who are not familiar with purity culture, how would you boil it down? And maybe what are some of the big markers of what actually purity culture is? Like maybe speak to purity rings, purity balls, which I just learned about, and it blew my mind. I thought it was one of the craziest things that I've ever heard about.
Yeah, I went to a purity ball with my father when I was in the 8th
Great.
grade. Yeah, so purity culture is very much this idea that I would say it's a reaction to the sexual revolution of the 60s, was Christians trying to reclaim a sexual ethic and doing so by highlighting and really focusing on a woman's virginity and purity and how men can, quote, protect their purity. But it's delved into, just concentrating on sex as a reward for marriage and a reward for staying pure, instead of actually having healthy conversations about sex. I mean, it's delved into teaching kids don't have sex, but not actually teaching them why in a healthy way. It's also rooted in a lot of misogyny. So yeah.
Yeah. And the purity ball, for everyone who is interested in, this was this article I saw. These were some pictures from a purity ball. I just love that they're in like an oil field, which is like so many interesting things. Here's another one. What is the purity ball? How would you explain it?
So a purity ball is a father-daughter ball where you go and you basically talk about purity while you're there, but also it's very much like I had to sign a purity pledge when I was there, basically promising my father that to remain a virgin until I was married, until he could give me away. And of course there's like dancing, and that's pretty innocent, I suppose, but it was very, like, it was less. I thought, in the 8th grade I was like, oh, I get to dress up in like a gown, I get to go with my dad and dance, because I'm like, woohoo, let's party. And then I get there and they're like, sign this piece of paper saying that pledge your virginity to your father, and here's why you have to do that. And it was like, this is not what I thought this was gonna be.
And that's probably like a legally binding contract too. No, I'm just kidding.
Probably.
Well, who knows? Yeah. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and there was like some prominent celebrities who had purity rings back in the day. Like I think Justin Bieber had a purity ring for a while, and maybe like Miley Cyrus even when she was younger.
Jonas Brothers did.
Jonas Brothers. So, what in your opinion, do you see a connection between purity culture and kind of all these sexual related scandals? Do you feel like they're connected anyway? You had that tweet that I thought was really good about it. And you've been posting a lot of stuff about the recent news about some prominent Christian pastors who have kind of fallen because of things that they've done. Do you feel like it's all kind of connected in a way?
I do. I mean, I don't think you can fully blame deep, dark sexual sin on just, the evangelicals trying to reclaim a sexual ethic. Because in some ways, I think that it can, things that are bad, like pornography, can also contribute to sex abuse happening. And, there's also power dynamics, and there's all sorts of things. But I do think it does, from growing up in a church where going on youth trips, girls had to have shorts that were so long, and we couldn't wear, we had to wear one-piece bathing suits, and we had all these like, dress code rules to try and foster purity. But then the boys could play basketball all day with their shirts off, and it didn't matter. It was very much on the policing of women. And like, I read so many books as an adolescent when I should have been given, first of all, as a theology student, now this is my personal pet peeve, I should have been given like theology books, but instead I was given, make sure your bra strap doesn't show because it'll make the boys lust after you. And I'm like, I'm 13 years old. Like I'm a child. Like if they're lusting after me, like that's kind of on them. Like that's kind of disturbing. So yes, I do think that it very much puts the blame on women for women have to keep themselves pure at any cost. And then if the man violates that, then it's their fault because they were the one that were making them lust to begin with.
Yeah. And I've been reading a lot and listening to a lot of podcasts, and I follow a good amount of like deconstruction Instagram accounts and social media accounts, and a lot of people are posting about it like all the time. I'm literally wrestling through this in therapy right now, trying to undo some of these harmful effects. And there's lots of people too who see the message as, hey, don't be sexually active at all until you get married. And then when you get married, like flip this switch and you're supposed to be, insanely sexually active. And then people have trouble flipping that switch. And then also, there was no purity ball for the boys, right?
No.
This was a daughter only event.
Yes. I mean, but
Yeah.
then there's the other side of it too, is that boys are taught that they are just sex machines, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
they're 16-year-old boys, they're sex machines. We have to talk to them about pornography and masturbating and having sex and, not going too far, blah, blah, blah. But as a girl, I think every girl was sitting there thinking, well, what about us that struggle with pornography problems? What about us? We have sexual thoughts and feelings too, and it's not just the boys that do. And so we're treated like we're supposed to be these delicate flowers that know nothing about sex, when in reality, teenage girls are probably just as sexual as boys too. We just don't treat them like that way, and it causes a lot of, it causes a lot of problems and guilt, because if you get sexually assaulted, you're sitting there thinking, well, I've never really even been taught about sex. You might not even realize you were sexually assaulted because
Yeah.
you were never taught the foundations of even what sex and sexual attraction is. So it's just weirdly gender biased on a lot of different ways.
Yeah, yeah. And so this article, I think we'll get into a lot more of that in nitty-gritty details. So this is a pastor. Let me pull this up next to me. This is a pastor in a church out by me in Chicagoland, and he was shopping this article around different people. It was gonna get posted in the Gospel Coalition, if you're familiar with them. It ended up falling through, and so he still hasn't actually found a place to share it yet. And I was like, I think this is gold. So I said, can we share it on our just even the .church website? And he said that's totally fine. So I put that in the chat if anyone wants to follow along as we're reading, if you have your computer and your phone. And Vince asks a good question. I think we'll hit that as we keep going. So we'll probably come back to that one sort of about fear. So Tim talks about his experience going through this, and talks about that it's, not just an idea and concepts, it's an industry, which is something interesting that we could talk about, that there's so much merchandise and books and stuff to be bought around the idea of purity culture. But before he dives into these 6 really harmful ideas related to purity culture, he says this, and I'll read it for us. A fair evaluation of purity culture should acknowledge that plenty of its core ideas are biblical. God's best for human sexuality is chastity, and for an unmarried person, that does include abstinence from sexual activity. Unplanned pregnancies, STIs, and heartache are real consequences of sexual sin. Purity is a biblical term. So I think even before we dive in, I think there's probably some people who are on this call who are thinking, man, I'm so glad that they're tackling purity culture. This probably means that they think anyone should be able to have sex whenever they want, regardless of their relationship. And I'm assuming you're more of a conservative background, and I'm in seminary as well, about to finish at Denver, which is a fairly conservative school. So I would not say, for anyone who's hoping that that's where we're going to land, they're probably going to be disappointed that we would take more of a biblical look of sexuality. However, now we're going to spend the next 30 minutes. Here's horrible ways that you can explain this. Horrible ways that you can live this out and teach your children. So let me put up, here's the first reason, and then we can talk about it for a second. So he references that First Thessalonians verse, which is showing that there is a concept in the Bible about purity, about living, not getting sexual immorality in all these different ways. But here's some of the ways that I think it can be taught wrong. So the first one, the first lie, and remember, these are bad things. It's the idea that of purity culture, that your wedding day is the finish line of your purity culture. This message is implicit in the motivation that runs along these lines. If you can make it to your wedding day a virgin, listen to all the benefits in store for you. Presumably, this is to give teenagers hope, something like you don't have to be abstinent forever. You just have to wait. There's light at the end of the tunnel, the day in your future when you will be able to have sex. He says there's several problems with this finish line mentality, both theologically and pastorally. First, everyone's called to be pure, not just unmarried people. A generation of purity culture graduates immersed in the finish line mindset have found themselves in crisis shortly after their honeymoons as a result of the shock that chastity doesn't always become easier after being married. Specifically, if the light at the end of the tunnel is the, I will one day no longer have to restrain the desires because sex will now be allowed, it becomes extremely difficult to navigate the realities of married life. E.g., that being married doesn't mean you just can have sex whenever you want. Chastity is a virtue that is every bit as important, sometimes every bit as difficult for a married person as it is for a single person. So what are your reactions to that? Do you feel like you've heard that message, the finish line idea, and then what would you see as along some of those same lines he's talking about, or differently, that is problematic about that?
I do. And I do think that Well, I think again, like we said, like the basis of some of these messages are biblical. I do think that sex is a beautiful consummation of marriage. I'm not married, so I can't fully even, talk on that. But I do think that it presents issues for women, as like especially women. For men, this is the message I've been given, that I am like a reward for my husband. And that, all pornography problems, masturbation problems, lust problems will now stop once women or a wife is now your sexual outlet. So you don't have to worry about being pure anymore, because you'll have a sexual outlet at your disposal. And but that can go for both genders either way. And I think that's really not a healthy way to approach purity and even just lust in general, because Paul is pretty specific about how, and Jesus too, about how it's more of a heart issue rather than access to a biblical way to lust, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And do you think it also makes sex still an idol, right? It's still like, here's the goal, here's the thing that you should be striving after. That's what I feel like. It still keeps it on this massively high pedestal. And so he says, he goes on, and I think this is even more crucial. Besides, in the end, not everyone gets married. Furthermore, Christians who hold to a biblical sexual ethic but are exclusively same-sex attracted don't even get to live with the hope of getting married. And that, obviously, that's one of those topics that we'll spend a whole week on that topic. So if you have questions about that, feel free to ask them. We may not get to them because that could take us down a whole rabbit trail. But in almost any room of teenagers hearing a purity lesson today, there are young people who have felt attraction to the same sex. What hope exists for these young people when the reward of abstinence is wrapped up in a wedding night they will have no reason to believe they will ever have? And here, it talks a little bit about the idolizing sex. The one thing that I did want to say that I think is interesting is that if you talk to Christian couples who aren't married, the biggest struggle for a lot of them, if they're trying to live out this biblical picture of waiting to have sex until they're married, it's usually like they literally can't keep themselves apart from each other, right? It's like, this is such a struggle, and the youth pastor or whoever is really diving into it with them. And then you see the opposite, that most couples who are married, when they go to counseling, a lot of times a big thing that they need counseling on is to convince them to have sex with each other. That it goes from, for some reason, pre-marriage, it's like, this is all we want to do. This is all we think about, all we care about. And then post-marriage, it's like, a lot of these people, we haven't had sex in 6 months or a year. And you try to help them see that this is something good. So there's clearly some sort of disconnect between what is the purpose of sex before you're married and after. And I think the way that we've been thinking about it might be a little bit skewed, probably from this finish line mentality.
Yes, I agree.
So here's the second point, and we'll try to keep a decent amount of time as we chug through these. This is a good one too. There is a category of people who make it to their wedding day sexually pure. The language of some purity teaching paints humanity into two camps: those who reach their wedding day pure and those who don't. Again, the theological and pastoral problems are myriad. This dichotomy assumes that purity equals declining to engage in sexual activity with another person. However, this falls far short of Jesus' teaching on sexual sin and purity. If anyone looks lustfully at a woman, he has already committed adultery with her in his heart. By that standard, which of us can claim that we reached our wedding day pure? The truth is that all of us who have taken wedding vows have done so as sexual sinners. We are all in need of God's grace, not just generally speaking, but specifically in our broken sexuality. Many engaged Christian couples have been harmed by this false dichotomy. One common example involves a marriage between a virgin and someone who is sexually experienced. The partner who is a virgin feels pride in their purity and subconscious resentment toward the impure partner. Meanwhile, the partner who is not a virgin can feel nothing but what they perceive to be God's frown on their wedding night. Intimacy can become a significant struggle in the early stages of such a marriage. It can take couples years to untangle this twisted theology, all of which could have been avoided had both partners clung to the gospel of grace, a gospel which says both of you are sexual sinners, impure and unworthy of the gift of God-honoring marital sexual intimacy. Yet in Christ, you are both completely forgiven and made clean, and God smiles on you as you are recipients of his good gift of marital sexual intimacy. So what are just some initial thoughts about that idea, the idea of the two categories, sexually pure, not pure?
I think that there is so much stigma in purity culture around being a virgin when you get married. Like that is the one stipulation that women or men or, you're supposed to be a virgin, but you know, penetrative sex is not the only way you can sexually sin. I mean, if you're assuming we're talking about straight couples, eh, losing your virginity in that way is not the only way you can sexually sin. I mean, and I think with the staggering statistics about even Christians watching porn, or even just, I mean, the books I read growing up talked about like hand holding, like premarital, like hand holding and kissing and fondling and all that. But I mean, I think that there is so much stigma that surrounds the specific thing of virginity that it makes it odd to, I think, cling to that as the only thing that really matters in terms of sexual purity, because exactly like the article said, I mean, Jesus specifically said you can commit adultery, but you're doing so in your heart by lusting over other people. And again, I think that's really where this idea of purity comes from. It's not this standard of, oh, am I a virgin, am I not? It's how is God renewing my heart every single day in a way that is pure and pointed towards him, and not pointed in acting out my lusts towards other people in whatever way it is, whether it's actually having penetrative sex and you losing your virginity, or it's watching porn. I think those are both equally abhorrent to God, and both are sexually immoral in that, in that way.
Yeah, no. So we got some good questions that have come in that we can maybe pause here and try to hit some of these. Andrew said, how would you address the slippery slope argument? And that, I think, is foundational to some of this purity culture stuff of totally pure in every possible way. Like you mentioned, hand holding. Maybe that's the standard in a lot of these, because if you were to go, if you put your arm around them, that could lead to who knows what. So what would be your thoughts on that?
Um, I mean, I think it starts with setting boundaries. I know that in relationships where I've had, at least where I have set most of the time, unfortunately, very clear boundaries of like, look, I am not doing X, Y, and Z with you. And I think it's up to you and God perhaps to determine exactly what. I mean, I don't want to speak. I don't want to speak on what everyone's boundaries should be, besides, what sexual immorality means to every single person. But setting clear boundaries, and then that you won't even go down that slippery slope. I mean, I know Christian couples that haven't kissed until their wedding day. Does that mean that their sexual life is any more blessed and pure and God honoring than people who decided that they could kiss and not go down that slippery slope? I can't speak to that, but I do think that I at least admire them for setting that boundary, because then they don't even, they don't even have to approach it. They made that conviction, and I think that's important too.
Yeah, the slippery slope, it is really an interesting idea, and I think for some people that can be true. And I think the way that I've thought about it is that you have to deal with building up self-control at some point in your life, whether it's going to be before you're married or while you're married. It has to happen eventually. I heard this in a podcast, but someone was saying the self-control, you have to have higher self-control probably in some cases when you're married than when you're single, because for a lot of us, it's like if you're sleeping next to your spouse and if you have the same sexual amount of energy that you did when you were 15 or whatever, and you have never tried to like grow in that area, your spouse is not going to want to sleep with you every single night. There's some statistic, it's like couples spend like 2% of their time married, like having sex. It's like a very small portion. So that whole idea of I can use this other person to fulfill all those desires is just not true. It's not reality. That's like not what it's for. And that's a really harmful, objectifying view of your spouse as, well, this is now, I used to get this from pornography, or from random people. Now I get to do it from this one person. And it's like, that's not any more loving or better in some way. That's still incredibly objectifying in a ton of ways. Here's some other questions. Vince says, would like to understand the misogyny connection better if you can talk about that in more detail. Maybe you could flesh that out a little bit better.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make broad statements about, oh, everything is sexist when it comes to sexual ethics and purity. I would just say, as a young woman growing up in this type of purity culture, again, like you already said, young men didn't go to purity balls. My brother did not have to sign a statement to my father saying that he was going to remain a virgin until marriage. And the books he was given to read as an adolescent did not talk about him, being modest in his clothing. So in order to not attract the lust of other young ladies, again, it's very concentrated upon women remaining pure, remaining virgins, remaining where I think the boys get a little bit of slack on their side. So that's where I say the misogyny comes in. It comes into viewing women as the objects, even like you were saying, the objects of the sexual of marriage. The point is to finally get to have your own sexual outlet, and your wife who has remained pure just for you. That's the greatest. I was told, the greatest gift you can give your husband is to be a virgin on your wedding day. I've never heard that said to a young man. In fact, I think the greatest gift you can give your spouse is to be a God honoring, loving person. So not a virgin. I mean, it's great, but that's not the greatest gift that I
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, yeah. And there's so many different ways that it's a double standard. I think I remember being in youth group, and like you mentioned, the emphasis was on the women to fix the problem of the men. And so if men were lusting, it was on the women. And I had a sermon once that I gave at my last church where I talked about like something, I think it was something about like yoga pants, and it was like, should women be able to wear yoga pants? And we basically were saying that Jesus, when he says, if your eye causes you to sin, so you're lusting after a woman in yoga pants, Jesus doesn't say, go tell the women to change her pants. It says, gouge out your eye, like solve the problem at the source. So I think it's a twist that we made, that it was, no, it's on the other person. It's the woman's problem, which is pretty ridiculous. All right, so there's a lot of good questions coming in. Mason said, at what age should I begin to talk to my kids about sex from the start? Maybe wait until puberty. Mason, I'm going to actually defer that question to an adult who has children. I have no children, and Leah has no children, as far as I know. We probably are not the best people. My hunch would say earlier rather than later to start the dialogue, but I'm going to let parents who have done this much longer speak to that. And there are some in this group who you could reach out to. My parents are a great example. They're both on this call. So Albert says, how prevalent do you think purity culture is today? I heard the author of the book, How I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua Harris is his name. He renounced the book he wrote when he was younger. Do you think that had any lessening of the effect of purity culture? And my initial thought is maybe a little, but probably not, because it still seems very pervasive. Leah, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I think the problems that purity culture has created such a strong reaction of opposition to it, that now it's very hard to have conversations about what a biblical sexual ethic should even be. I do think that, like a lot of young women, I mean, I remember just raving about dress code things when I was a teenager, because to me it didn't seem fair that my shoulder was more distracting to a guy in class than just me like being there, and so I think that I think purity culture is lessening, but not so much because we are fixing the actual issues inside the church of talking about sex in a healthy way, but from a countercultural reaction of people being like, this is awful, and so now it's causing, I think, almost even more problems.
Yeah, yeah. Deb says, in Mere Christianity, there's a quote that everyone knows the sexual appetite. Here, I actually can throw these chats up on the screen. I completely forgot I had that ability. There's a quote that everyone knows the sexual appetite grows by indulgence. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like you're disagreeing and saying that purity is what grows the appetite. Thoughts? I would say it's not that purity grows it. I think it's the obsession that grows it. If you tell people this is going to be the best thing of your life, this is the ultimate goal of your life, and you can't have any of it until you get married, and then you're constantly thinking about it, and a lot of people will get that from pornography, and they'll, get it from other people, and then they'll feel immense amounts of guilt, immense amount of shame. And a lot of times, I think the studies say that women feel the shame in much greater amounts than the men do. So it's not that I'm saying you should be going out and sleeping with everyone. It's that the focus of it, when it's so heavy, so intense, that's what I think grows the appetite and makes us think, we gotta have this, we gotta have this, we gotta have this, when it's such an incorrect picture of what sex is in an actual marriage context. And if you ask any of your married friends, especially if you ask your married friends who were sexually active before they got married. You like stand-up comedians talk about this. Like there is a shift that they'll tell you about. They'll say we did a lot more stuff before we were married, and then when we got married, it really switched. And so there is some sort of fundamental switch when it becomes like, oh, I have arrived. And maybe we could talk really quick about this third point, just because it's kind of along those same lines. This is the third point of the article. Your married sex life will be amazing if you wait. This one I specifically remember hearing at youth group in 8th grade. An older gentleman in the church enthusiastically shared, "My wife and I were virgins on our wedding night, and let me tell you, it was worth it. If you wait, it is a mind-blowing experience." The first and most obvious problem with this claim is that the Bible never makes such a promise, but it is an error that breeds further damage. For example, a Christian married couple in their 20s or early 30s finds themselves in a rut. They're struggling sexually either with pain or impotence or awkwardness. Since the old messages from the teenage years about mind-blowing marital sex for those who save themselves are still seared into their minds, they think, something's wrong with me. We waited until we were married. This isn't supposed to happen. I'm a failure. They don't talk to anyone about their struggles because in their minds, there's no way their peers are having these struggles. These are supposed to be struggles experienced only by old people and people who have sex before they were married. When some friends started opening up to my wife and I about their struggles in this area, we were so comforted. I remember the relief. So it's not true that everyone besides us who got married as virgins is experiencing sex as unmitigated, blissful delight. This in turn emboldened us to talk more freely with trusted friends about our own struggles, and we found that many of those friends had experienced similar troubles, including the intense accompanying shame. How sad that purity culture teachers have sought to improve on God's gospel by making new promises on his behalf that he neither made nor sanctioned. One generation makes the false promises, the next generation reaps the fruit. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm not married, so I don't really want to comment on how amazing my sex is going to be because I don't know. But I do think that I was definitely taught this. Like, I was definitely taught, like, oh, if you wait until you are married to have sex, then it will be amazing and incredible, and you will never. I think, I do think it is important to tell people that, well, that's another point. We can get into it later, that, being virgins when you get married means that you don't have quite as much sexual baggage or for a lot of different things. There's no there's no unplanned pregnancies, there's no intimacy with another person that you're thinking about, and that can help make your married sex amazing for sure. But as far as just it being amazing just because you're both virgins, I mean, I've read statistics about women not being able to even have sex because they've been conditioned to have, I forget the exact, maybe somebody knows the exact medical term for women being unable to have sex without it being painful, but they start clenching up and it's just awful, and it's the reverse of what they've been told their whole life. It's supposed to be amazing, but they're virgins and they don't even know how to. They don't even, it causes medical problems. Does that make sense? I'm trying to remember that.
I know what you're talking about. I don't know the name, but I know what you're talking about. I feel like I've heard that before. Yeah, and I think the big thing too is that the Bible, like, to make promises outside of what the Bible says is always kind of a bad idea, because if like that's not even what the scripture says, then we're probably not really right to make those claims. And you said something else too, but now I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something really, really meaningful, and now I lost my train of thought. If it comes back, Hassana said, from back to the earlier point, it focuses more on the male gaze when it comes to how women dress. That's completely true. Everything is seen through the eyes of the male. That's the very patriarchal way of thinking about it. Aaron Steele, what's up, Aaron Steele? Nice to see you on here. That's my old friend from elementary school. Once married, the culture emphasizes that women should always be available. Yes, 100%. That's the big purity culture piece of it. James, yes, Anthony, I love that sermon. He was there. He was there that night. Have you considered gouging your eye out? That was good. That was good. So we may have to split this into two parts. We may have to come back because it feels like there's still a lot we have to cover. There's even 3 more points in the article that we did not get to. So we'll maybe have to extend this to another week and keep the conversation going that way. But feel free, if anyone in the meantime, if there's like questions that you really have on your heart that you're like, well, what about this? What about this? Oh, and I see some people actually posted it in. They said,
that
Uh,
Yeah, vagismus is what I've heard it as.
got it. And then dyspareunia is the medical term, and then the colloquial term. Thank you, Albert, and thank you, Tess, coming in with the facts. So that's great. So if any of you do have any like big burning questions between now and when we come back to this topic, you could feel free to email me. I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and here it is. But I just want to give a big thanks to Leah. Thanks so much for diving into this. This is like what a fun topic to have on a Tuesday night as part of your seminary career. So we're super happy that you were on with us. If everyone can say thanks in the chat.